Good morning, everyone. My name is Thomas Bowles. I'm the extension agent here in Prince William County. Joining me is Don Peshka. He's Master Gardener. Don's going to take the first part of class, and I'm going to take the second part. And then at the end, we're going to answer questions.
I'm not a weed expert, but we're going to talk a lot about weeds today. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to kind of have a little fun. We're going to do a survey. You see this chart in front of you? When I do this class in person, I usually take a sample of this, what might be or not be a weed. So I want you to tell me, in your opinion, is this a weed? It's white clover is what it is, or is it not a weed? And when you get through, I want to tell you why I did this. So I get the same result today as I would if I did this class in person. A lot of you said, yeah, it's a weed. A lot of you said, no, it's not a weed. So the question is it a weed? And I'm going to tell you what Dr. Askew, who's the weed expert at Virginia Tech, says about this. He says, you know what? A weed is really in the mind of the beholder. There's a lot of people who take wild plants that you might consider weeds, and they don't consider them weeds. They like dandelions. They like white clover. They like buttercups. They like wild violet. So to be honest with you, a weed is really what you think it is. So what is a weed? Here's one definition: a plant whose virtues have not been discovered. But honestly, it's whatever you really think it is. And I'm going to keep referring to Dr. Askew. What he says is when you're talking about lawn weeds, one of the first things you have to do, and we'll just leave this chart up for a minute, is you got to take a look at the soil in your property, because that's the key to everything. So he encourages you to do a soil sample first. And then the second thing you want to do is identify the weed. And here's kind of some of the things you need to do to identify that weed. You got to kind of know what the weed characteristics are. Number one, boy, there's a lot of seeds. There really are. As example, hairy bittercress, you got about 5,000 per plant. Annual bluegrass will last about 5 years, and it's got a lot of seeds. Chickweed will last 10 years. So you got a lot of seeds in there, and they're going to just stay there. They're going to be there. Some of them have deep roots. Some spread by runners, stolons and rhizome. Wild violets do that. Now, what's the key to these weed characteristics? Just because there's a lot of seeds there, it doesn't mean they're all going to germinate every year. Some of them are going to get eaten by insects, some by birds, some by microorganisms, but the key is they're there. And when the conditions are right, they're going to come up. They're going to love you. That's why we say 1 year's weeding, 1 year seeding, 7 years weeding. Now, Dr. Askew says the second thing you got to do really is you got to identify the weeds. And that's not real easy, but one of the first things you need to know is what are weed life cycles? And there's three. There's annuals, and there's perennials, and there's biennials. Annuals actually have two types: a winter annual and a summer annual. A winter annual is one where the weeds actually can germinate right now in the fall. I actually have chickweed germinating right now in my vegetable garden. And of course, I'm pulling it out by hand in the vegetable garden particularly. And the winter annuals, they'll come up, they'll germinate now or in early spring. And when they come up, they're probably only going to live till about the middle of summer. The temperatures just get too high. And summer annuals, they're going to come up a little bit later when the temperatures in the soil get to be about between 50 and 55. One of our famous summer annuals is crabgrass. And there's another one we see a lot when we do best lawns, and that's called Lespedisia. But now they're going to last till winter time, and then they're going to die back because crabgrass will die back. Then there's a biennial. It takes about 2 years to complete its cycle. As you can see, the first year produces a rosette, and second year it produces a flower stalk, and then it dies. And then there's our good old buddy, the perennial. It lives, I say forever. It really doesn't, but forever. Now, it doesn't germinate. I mean, it doesn't come up and stay up all year. For instance, a good example of that is wild violet. I have wild violets in my front yard. Not a lot of them, but I've just decided I'm okay with them. But they come up sometime around May. If you came in my yard today, we'd walk around, I'd show you where they are. If you came back in December, I'd give you $5 if you could find it, because it's going to be gone. Now, as part of identifying weeds, these cycles are important, but the next chart here I'm going to show you is a document that we have that's available to everyone who's out there listening today. It's called Common Turf Weeds. And it shows a lot of pictures, which is key, because if you're not familiar with weeds, and I wasn't when I became a master gardener, it's taken me years and years to kind of learn the common ones. But this has pretty good pictures. So you could take this document, walk around your yard and just see, hey, do I have any of these? And it's kind of going to help you. What's really going to help you is what Thomas is going to do later on, because he's going to actually show you not just pictures, but actual weeds. So how do we handle weeds, especially in our turf? Here's a list of ways to handle weeds. But before I kind of get into this, I want to talk to you a little bit about what the change in dealing with weeds, the changes to the philosophy of it in major universities across this country. When I became a master gardener, one of the things that we received as a training guide was a pest management guide for homes and grounds. And the last chart of my briefing here has that as a reference for you. And I'm going to keep emphasizing this. All you have to do to get that document is go on and type in Virginia Tech Pest Management Guide, Homes and Ground. And when it comes up, there's a chapter on lawn care. That chapter is chapter 5. The first 8 pages are on diseases, and then the rest of it is on weeds. In 2007, when I became a master gardener, when I opened the Pest Management Guide to chapter 5 to the section on weeds, it was about 8 pages long. There wasn't one mention about any other way to handle weeds but chemical. That whole philosophy has changed. In the 2020 edition of the Pest Management Guide for Homes and Grounds, the first 2.5 pages, there's not one mention of chemicals. Now, the rest of it, which is about another 18 pages, it does tell specifics of chemicals. But the key now is they're concentrating on mechanical and cultural. And then if you do need chemical, that'd be kind of like your last resort. That's kind of the difference in what the approach has been. And by the way, this isn't just Virginia Tech. This is based on a lot of research done across the country in universities. And Dr. Askew is going to tell you, about 70% of good weed control in turf is cultural. Talk about practices for weed control. Now, you got to kind of decide your own threshold. I kind of call it the drive-by look. Remember I said I have wild violets? If you drive by my yard, even right now, you really can't see them. The threshold of my grass is up high enough to where you can't see them. So you got to kind of make that decision. And then the second thing is, if you're going to do something, you want to ID that weed. Where is it found? What's its susceptible life cycle? Is it an annual? Is it a biannual? Is it a perennial? Now here's cultural control recommendations. And this is a key again, Dr. Askew is saying. You want to minimize conditions that we'd prefer. If you got wet spots, you may need to regrade them. You want to mow high. Dr. Askew says, do you know what the number one thing is that homeowners do that contribute a lot to weed germination? What do you think it might be? Yeah, it's cutting the grass too short. Because when you do that, it lets those weed seeds down there have access to water and air. I tell you, they love you. They are so happy to be in your yard. So what we're recommending, what he's recommending, is that you mow your grass, especially if you're cool season, and most of us have cool season grasses, 3 to 3.5 inches. And it kind of helps prevent germination of those weed seeds. Now you can use other things, ground covers and mulch. You want to meet the needs of your turf, because a thick, healthy turf is the best defense for less weeds in your lawn. And you can aerate if you need to. And kind of a good way to tell if you need aeration is take a good strong screwdriver and go down, push it down in your yard. And if it goes down fairly easy, okay, maybe you don't need aeration this year, perhaps. Now, we're not going to completely eliminate the need for use of herbicides, but if you do need them, you kind of need to know there's two types. There's selective and non-selective. And selective is simply, it's a chemical that will kill weeds and not the grass. And there's all different kinds. And then there's non-selective. And fundamentally, almost all non-selective have the chemical glyphosate. Used to be Roundup was about the only one that had glyphosate, but they had a patent on it, and the patent has expired. So there's other companies that use glyphosate. It's a very good weed killer, but it's also going to kill other plants, including grass. And particularly, they don't want you doing either the selective or the non-selective on a windy day. And when you use any kind of herbicide, you need to follow the directions specifically. And Dr. Askew recommends the use of concentrate, where you buy the concentrate and mix it. Because he said the premix, which there are a lot of premixes at our common stores, they haven't been able to tell just how long it lasts. I will tell you, I've actually used both, and I don't use them on my turf itself. I use them around my fence line where I have quite a few weeds, and both of them work. Now, he also tells you that when you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, the products you can buy there are about 60% of the rate that professionals use. So they're probably not at the same level. I will tell you that in that pest management guide on pages 5-26 and 5-27, this is probably a little technical, but there's a good chart. It's got a list of broadleaf weeds, and it tells you what kind they are. There's a little column that says classification. A equals annual, P equals perennial, WA is winter annual, and so on and so on. And then there's 5 columns. And at the top of each one of those columns is a list of chemicals. And then as you go down, like if you pick a weed out, chickweed say, and you go down that chart, it'll tell you of those, which is it susceptible to those chemicals. But here's the key. It doesn't give you the commercial name of the product. It's a list of chemicals. So once you've identified your weed and you want to use a chemical, you need to go to the store and look on the bottle to see what the chemicals are so you pick the right one. Okay, now one thing I forgot to say something about was the mechanical approach to weed control. And I'm sorry I missed that on my before chart, but mechanical is pretty simple, really. It's hand pulling weeds. And Dr. Askew says, hey, that's what people did years ago. And by the time you figure out what weeds you got, and you go through that process I just talked about, figuring out what chemical to buy, you go buy it. you mix it appropriately, and then you apply it. He said it might take 1 to 3 weeks for it to work. You might have to do it again. By the time you do that, you or your kids or your grandkids can pull one heck of a lot of weeds. So it's a good way to, especially if your yard isn't 50% weeds, because if it is, you're not probably gonna hand pull them. All right, let's talk a little just turf weeds. Okay, it's a plant out of place. Yeah, and we already talked about how they can be hardy, and they're good competitors. They spread by seeds. An allelopathic effect is just an organism that produces, and it influences the germination of other plants, and that's what allelopathic is. So why might you control them? Okay, here's some good reasons. They compete for water. You can just kind of read them there. But once again, the best weed control in turf is a thick, healthy turf. And we keep repeating that mantra. And here's kind of how you develop a good, healthy turf. Now, so back in July, Natalie Walker did one of these classes on 12, it's called 12 Steps to Improve Your Turf. These are kind of some of those steps, and they're listed in the Pest Management Guide for Homes and Ground on the second page. But here's the key. First thing, you need a soil test. You need to adjust that pH. It needs to be somewhere between 6.3 and 6.7 or 8. And I can tell you that from doing a large number of best lawns over the last 10 years, most homes in Prince William County, when you get the pH back, it requires lime to adjust the pH. We want you to use the appropriate rates of fertilizer. Don't over fertilize. Do it at the right times. We recommend strongly in the months September, October, November, or sun. If you need to do it in the spring, which we recommend you not if possible, unless you've got a new lawn, you want to do it at half the rate. If you need to overseed, do it. And most grasses, over time, you're going to need to overseed some. Another thing you want to do is measure your turf area, because when Virginia Tech comes back with your soil test results, and I'm assuming you're all going to do it, okay? It's going to tell you how much fertilizer to put down in lime per 1,000 square feet. So you kind of have to have an idea. And I can tell you from experience, from doing best lawns, if you ask people how many square feet they have, they'll tell you how many. And most times when you actually measure it, they have pretty much overstated the size of their turf area. Another key that I've mentioned before, you want to mow high. Get it as high as you can get it. The weeds aren't going to like it, but you are. If you need to do surface drains, you want to do that. You want to aerate if you need to, and top dress. Top dress is simply compost. And master gardeners have a mantra: compost, compost, compost. It's probably the most important way you can improve soil that is not in good shape. And what you need is about 1/4 of an inch for each application. And you can buy compost from the county at the county waste facilities. It's reasonably priced. You do have to have a pickup to do that. It's about $25 a yard, but they just load it with the top loader. You're going to get more than a yard. So we recommend that if you need to improve your soil. And you want to avoid shallow irrigation or over irrigation. You want to water about 1 inch a week. If you have slopes, you might want to do it 1/2 inch a week. One good way to tell 1 inch is to take a tuna can and go out there and run your watering system, either an automatic one or whatever you use to water, till that tuna can fills up to 1 inch, and then remember how long it took, and that's how long you need to run your water. Preferably, you want to water in the morning. Okay, now these are the references I mentioned. The Pest Management Guide, I told you how to get onto that. Virginia Tech does have a weed guide page. It's better than it has been in the past. It actually, you kind of have to tell it what weed you want to go to give the pictures. But the best one is this University of Maryland Extension Weed ID, because it's got excellent pictures of common broadleaf weeds. All right, now we're going to take a weed walk. Actually, Thomas is going to do this.
Check your local extension office in your state and see what labs they recommend. Some states have state labs, others don't. The other thing is Don was talking about the program we have locally, Best Lawns, and Best Lawns takes a lot of the guesswork out because we send master gardeners out and they will measure your lawn for you and help identify weeds. And then you'll get a nutrient management plan that shows you exactly how much you need to add and when to do that. So let's look at weeds. So Don was talking about, the drive-by. How does my yard look when I drive past it? And, we've got some examples here. And for the record, they were taken while I was stopped. But, you look at these and some of these are in some bad shape, like in the lower right. The island looks pretty good. And even the hillside behind it looks pretty good from the road. And think about, who do you care who sees the grass? I mean, if you're worried about what it looks like when you're standing on top of it, or do you worry about what the neighbors think? And that may adjust your weed tolerance some. So here's that island. And again, it looks pretty uniform and it looks pretty nice. However, you can see starting around where that mulch is, there's some grass coming out. That's Bermuda grass, which is a very invasive perennial weed. And to the left of that, there's some Bermuda grass mixed in there. But even with that, this grass looks pretty good. And this is an island that VDOT mows, and that's all they really do to it. And so think about your weed tolerance. So let's look at grassy weeds. So here we have a bunch of grasses. The bigger leaf ones here in the center, going up here, that's Japanese stilt grass. And then we've got some various fescues around. There's also some strawberry in there and some clover. But Japanese stilt grass is considered invasive. Japanese stilt grass gets its name from the stilts or pegs that shoot down. So here's the original root. It sprouts and then it kind of goes over to the side. And as it goes over to the side, the nodes will drop down these stilts and they will end up rooting. You can see the one root that didn't break off when I pulled that. But that's Japanese stilt grass. And there's a close-up of one of the stilts. This is everybody's favorite, crabgrass. Crabgrass, one of the things to notice about crabgrass is crabgrass kind of grows erratically from the center. It's not very uniform from the center. It's probably the most common weed grass we have in the United States, certainly in Northern Virginia. Here's a close-up of younger crabgrass. And crabgrass, now in this picture you can't really see it, but in this picture you definitely can. Crabgrass a lot of times will be red in the center or purplish red like that, particularly with young crabgrass. And that's what a crabgrass flower looks like. It's the same flower that stilt grass has. And this is a crabgrass flower from over in here. All the stilt grass behind, it's going to have that same type of flower. Here's crabgrass in the middle of fescue. Over here we have sedges, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So this grass is another, let me back up. Stilt grass and crabgrass are both summer annuals. This is also summer annual. This is goose grass. And goose grass is usually white in the center and it usually goes out like spokes in a wheel, pretty uniform. This is the flower for goose grass. You can see the very different, it's the same basic shape, but the seeds hold on in a very different manner. They're much more tightly held and they're held at an angle. This mess is all kinds of grasses, but the weed that we're looking for is another summer annual. And if you look at the little puffy things, that's the key to this particular grass. This is Foxtail. And so here we have the flower, a little fluffy bit. Foxtail a lot of times is planted on purpose, even though it's an annual, and it ends up becoming weedy in lawns and disturbed surfaces. Basically, when you disturb surface for construction to get off bond for the landscaping, you have to show that there's a ground cover. And a lot of times if you finish your work in the middle of the summer, the only thing you can use is foxtail. So you seed with that, get your bond off, and then whoever owns it will then overseed with the cool season grass. And again, I'm talking Northern Virginia, Maryland type area where we mainly use fescues. It's not a bad grass to have, but it's the more annual grass you have in the yard means that in the wintertime, you're going to have bare spots and you might have other weeds that come in. So here's more foxtail. Foxtail's fairly broad in its leaf width. This is giant foxtail. This we don't tend to see in yards, but you'll see it on the margins of woods. You'll see it on the margins of meadows, as in this area, and you'll see it on roadsides in disturbed surfaces. The nice thing about giant foxtail is it has these really pretty seed heads to them. You can dry them and use them in flower arrangements, but other than that, we really don't want to see those in our yard. Okay, so here we have another grass. It's a little hard to tell if you're not used to it. This is Nimblewill, and Nimblewill is a shade-tolerant perennial warm season grass. And so there's nothing really wrong with Nimblewill. In fact, it's a native plant. The problem that most people have with Nimblewill is that it's a warm season plant, and so it goes into dormancy. And so late fall through early spring, it's going to have a tan color to it, and it's going to look like it's dead. If you can live with that, Nimblewill is a pretty good grass. But for most people, they consider it a weed. Nimblewill, like other perennial grass weeds, is difficult to kill. And so if you don't want it in your yard, you need to be able to ID it quickly and pull it, ideally, before it gets established. And then you won't have to spend years on chemical treatments. Also in this picture, we have, let's see, we've got some clover down here. We've got some ground ivy, a little more clover. Over here, we've got some strawberries, lots of different weeds in this particular area. This is the bane of my existence. This is the perennial Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is a warm season grass. It's sometimes referred to as wire grass. There are cultivars of Bermuda grass that, if you're farther south, make a really nice lawn. But we have the weedier native, or excuse me, it's not native, but the wild variety here in Northern Virginia. And it is very aggressive. If you're fertilizing your grass in the summer, you're not fertilizing your grass, you're fertilizing those weeds. And if one of those weeds is Bermuda grass will love you. This grass can tolerate high doses of fertilizer, and it is invasive. It will get in your flower beds, it will get in your yard, it will go into your neighbor's yard. It's not a very good way to be friendly with your neighbors if you allow Bermuda grass to get into their yard. I spend a lot of time every summer pulling this. Here's a little bit closer up. One of the differences between Nimblewill and Bermuda grass is that Nimblewill is more shade tolerant. Nimblewill also spreads by stolons, which are runners on the top. Bermuda grass spreads by stolons and rhizomes, which are runners on top of the soil and in the soil itself. So let's talk about sedges. Sedges are grass-like plants, but they're not really grasses. Sedges have edges, they say, and if you feel the edge of the stem, it'll be triangular. You will definitely feel the edges if you try and roll it in your fingers. Typically in our area, we're looking at one of the nut sedges, which is yellow nut sedge or purple nut sedge. Sedges, the problem with sedges in the yard is that they tend to grow quicker than your grass, and they're this light green color that stands out really prominently, and most people don't like that. When we ask people about grass quality, uniformity is the number one thing that people rate grass on, whether they do it consciously or not. There have been experiments at several universities where people have been shown an area that's 100% crabgrass, and people have pointed that out and said, that's the best turf plot. And it's because of uniformity in color. And so when you have something like sedges that have a color that's pronouncedly different, it tends to make people think the yard is not of good quality. And here we have an infestation of sedge. Nut sedges are kind of interesting because they form little tubers, and they're edible tubers, actually. Birds really like them, particularly turkeys. But the problem with nut sedge is that once they form those tubers and you try and pull those out, nut sedge comes out really easily. But the connection to that tuber to the rest of the plant will snap off, and the tuber will stay there and it will just resprout. So you want to deal with sedges early in the summer when they're young. If you can do it before they put 5 leaves on, then you're probably going to be able to control it by hand pulling. Otherwise, it's going to be a couple rounds of hand pulling over the summer. And this is a little bit blurry, but this is a close-up of the sedge. You can see one of the edges here. You know, the roots are they look thick, but they're fairly flimsy. And like I say, they will snap off pretty easily. If you're trying to control sedge with chemicals, understand that you need a sedge-specific chemical, or, as Don said, a non-selective chemical like glyphosate. Sedges aren't grasses, so you can't use grass killer, and they're not broadleaf, so you can't use broadleaf. The number one mistake people make is assuming it's a grass, and they put down a grass killer, and then they ask, well, why didn't it do anything? So let's look at broadleaf weeds. This broadleaf weed is Lespedisia, and Lespedisia can take over a yard really quick. On the good side, it's an annual. It's a summer annual. And it's got, 3 leaflets together, and it sort of looks like clover, and it's in that same family. The problem, again, is it's an annual, so when it dies back, it leaves a lot of open space. You can get erosion. You can get more invasive weeds to colonize those areas as well. That's a close-up of a Lespedisia flower. You don't usually see those. They're very discreet. Lespedisia also has woody stems, and so as the summer goes, the stems get woodier. And so from a recreational standpoint, it's not the most fun thing to run barefoot in. This should be very familiar to everybody. This is a dandelion. Dandelions are perennials. Typically, people want to kill them early in the summer or late spring when they're in flower. Actually, the best time to kill them is now. If you're using herbicides, this is when they're most susceptible to herbicides. Down here, this clover-like plant is actually wood sorrel, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This is carpet weed. This is an interesting weed. We usually see it on the margins of turf. We don't see it a lot in turf, but you'll see this in gardens, and you'll see this kind of on that margin between your garden and the turf, or between the woods and the turf. This is interesting because it's easy to hand pull, but when you hand pull it, it's kind of sticky. And this is it matting in some mulch. This is Ajuga, or bugleweed. This is a very shade tolerant plant. People will buy it as Ajuga, as an ornamental, and it comes in a variety of colors. It comes in a variety of leaf textures. It's a really pretty plant. The great thing about it is it's one of the early flowering plants, and so it throws up these beautiful purple flower spikes that's really good for early pollinators. The downside is it spreads, especially in shade. It will spread very quickly. Personally, I've found that in full sun, it tends not to do quite as well because it is very shallow rooted. It's fairly easy to pull, but you can also treat it chemically. If you have Ajuga in your yard, honestly, pulling it is much easier and much quicker than figuring out what herbicide you need, going to get it, and then mixing it and then spraying it, as Don was talking about earlier. So here we have wild strawberry, and it's a little bit hard to see from this picture, but you can see the little yellow flowers. It's got jagged edge leaves. Wild strawberry is a spreader as well. Wild strawberry is difficult to pull, but it's also difficult to kill with herbicides. This is another one of those plants that if you don't want it in your yard, as soon as you see it, get rid of it, because it can be extremely difficult to get rid of with herbicides. And as someone who has hand pulled it to get it out of his garden, I can tell you it is not a fun task. Here we have a close-up of the strawberry flower and its leaves. It looks very much like our commercial strawberry, only smaller fruits. Here we have the strawberry and fruit. And about this time of year, you're going to start seeing some of those fruits as well as the yellow flowers, although usually all summer they're flowering and fruiting. This is pepperweed. Pepperweed is an obnoxious, invasive weed that's really difficult to kill as well. And mixed in with the pepperweed, we've got clover. The pepperweed has these little balls that it gives it its name, and they basically explode with seeds when they're ready. And this is pepperweed up close. If you see this, this is another weed that get rid of, pull it as quick as you can before it flowers. And that's a trick. If you're going to control a weed, control it before it flowers. Once a weed starts to set seed, a lot of times if you treat it with an herbicide, it's going to put whatever energy it's got left into getting those seeds to be mature. And the same thing if you pull it, it's going to want to propagate itself, and so it's going to put whatever energy it has left into trying to mature the seeds it has on it. So a good rule of thumb is get it before it flowers. And this is pepperweed in a grassy area. And you can see over here sedges as well. This is a very weedy, grassy area. This is not something we typically see in turf, but a lot of times we see it on the margins of turf. This is a bramble. Honestly, I can't remember if it's a wild blackberry or wild raspberry, but either way, you treat them the same. These are things you don't want to establish in your yard, because once they establish, they're very difficult to kill. The more wild varieties of brambles tend to have thorns and lots of them. So if you're going to hand pull them, even when they're little, do that with gloves. This matted, well, we have two things going on here. We've got the matted mess, and then we've got crabgrass in the upper left, but from the center sweeping to the right, this is spurge. And spurge is an interesting plant. When you break it, it produces a milky sap, and some people are sensitive to it. Not a whole lot of people are, but some people are sensitive to it. So if you're pulling this, you might want to wear gloves if you've never pulled it before and don't know how you'll react. Spurge has a deep taproot, and so sometimes it's difficult to get out of the ground if you're hand pulling. If the ground is damp and you pull with a twisting motion, usually you can get the whole plant pretty easily. But if the ground is really dry, the root's going to snap off on you. This big broadleaf plant is Broadleaf Plantain. Broadleaf Plantain is a perennial, although sometimes it dies back in the winter depending on your microclimate. It's really easy to hand pull. You might want to keep it in your yard, you might not. I personally don't mind them. It reminds me of growing up, but they're fairly easy to pull. They're a little more difficult to treat with chemicals. This is the broadleaf plantain's cousin, the buckthorn plantain, and you can see it's got much thinner leaves than its broadleaf friend or its broadleaf relative. And again, in this particular grass, we've got clover. This thin wispy grass is fine fescue. Now here we have clover. White clover, sorry about that. White clover, as we mentioned at the top, some people consider a weed, some people consider it part of lawns. White clover has an interesting history because clovers and grasses evolved together and they form symbiotic relationships. And for the longest time, if you bought grass seed, you bought actually grass and clover seed together. Up until post-World War II, clover was regularly considered a part of lawns. After World War II, we had some chemical companies that needed to produce something, and they got into herbicides, and pretty much every herbicide that treats broadleaf weeds will kill clover. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, clover is easy to kill with herbicide, unfortunately. But clover is a healthy part of a grass system. Clover will put nitrogen in the soil, so that means you don't have to add as much fertilizer. So again, that's another reason to think about clover for your yard. One thing I want to point out two things actually in this picture. If you see over here on the right, this jagged white tip at the end of that grass blade, that's from having a mower that is dull. The duller your mower blade, the more it rips as opposed to cuts. It creates a larger surface area wound and disease can get in. Speaking of diseases, this yellow stuff all over these grass blades, that's rust. And rust is a fairly common disease in grasses. Rust is a problem in grains. In turf, it really doesn't hurt the plant. It's just a cosmetic issue. So here we have on the left, we've got white clover, and you can tell from the puffy white flowers. And then on the right, we have wood sorrel. And wood sorrel is not a clover, although it does have, trifold leaves. Its leaflets are heart-shaped, and it's got these yellow flowers to it. And some people confuse the two. Wood sorrel does not add nitrogen. Clover will. And so we have yet another clover lookalike. And this black looking clover, that's black medic. That actually is a clover. Again, because of color and texture, a lot of people don't like it in their yard. And so they consider it a weed. And here we actually have wood sorrel and black medic together. You can tell easily by the color difference which is which. And here we have the leaves together with clover and black medic. They're in the same family, so black medic actually will put some nitrogen into your soil. Black medic is extremely difficult to kill with herbicides. This is ground ivy, and this is one of my favorite shade-tolerant ground covers. It does really well in the shade, and it's a nice perennial. It spreads by runners. In a garden situation, it's really easy to pull. In turf, it's a little more of a challenge to pull. But it will stay green pretty much all year, except in the depths of winter where it will turn a bronzy color. But in the spring, it'll recover right back. This is a good choice if you've got heavy, heavy shade where grass isn't going to grow. If this is an area that you want to get rid of, then more than likely, if you've got any sizable amount of it, you're probably going to need herbicide, but it is difficult to kill with herbicides. A lot of our lawn weeds are difficult to kill with herbicides. Now this up close is a wild violet. You can see the kind of swirl at the base of the leaf. As Don mentioned, wild violets will die back to the ground in wintertime, and then they'll pop back up in the spring. So next we're going to look at moss. And this is a whole big mess. This is in a very shady area. 9 times out of 10, if you have moss in your yard, it's because shade. Because you have too much shade for grass, and grass can't compete with other things. Other reasons why you might have moss would be damp soil, very compacted soil, or very acidic soil. So if we look at this mess, if you will, we've got lots of moss. We've got broadleaf plantains, little scattered bits of grass. Down here, it looks like we've got some wood sorrel going on. That, I believe, is Rebecca over there. This is more of a garden area. This is more the turf area. Crabgrass. But moss will do really well in the shade. Moss is not a broadleaf plant, and so you cannot use a broadleaf weed killer to kill moss. You have to use a special mossicide. Moss is actually a really pretty plant if you get up close to it and look at it. Mosses come in different colors, different textures. And again, if you've got deep shade, moss is an excellent ground cover to consider. If you have an area that you want in grass, you can't get grass to grow, you have moss, you kill the moss and it comes back, that's nature telling you you have way too much shade. So sometimes you just have to live with that. Sometimes you can limb up trees to get more sunlight. But usually if you've got a heavy infestation of moss, it's telling you you've got too much shade, and you should consider either moss as a ground cover or some other shade tolerant ground cover. Finally, mushrooms. I get asked all the time, are mushrooms bad for my yard? And the answer is no. Mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of fungi. When the conditions are right, mushrooms will pop up, and the mushrooms will, or the fungi rather, will reproduce. And so it's not harming the grass. Sometimes you have issues with, like if you've cut trees down, sometimes you'll get mushrooms, and that's just the fungi that's digesting the stump and the roots that are in the ground, popping up and wanting to reproduce. But mushrooms really aren't a problem unless you've got kids or dogs that like to eat things. A lot of these mushrooms are poisonous, and so that could be a problem. Really, there's no way to get rid of mushrooms other than basically to kick them over and kind of rub them into the ground. And again, more mushrooms, crabgrass, little bits of sedges in here. That's nimblewill. This broadleaf stuff, this is Kentucky 31 tall fescue. Again, more mushrooms. With that, though, we will we'll entertain questions. So if our chat helpers can look at the chat box.
There are no questions in the chat
There are no
box.
questions. Really interesting. Well, if anyone has questions, if they want to unmute their mic and ask those questions, we're happy to answer them.
Hello?
Yeah, you
Huh?
mentioned wild strawberry.
Yes.
I've got a ton of that and would really like to get rid of it. How do I get rid of it?
You're so first of all, let me ask: are you in Virginia?
Yes.
Okay, because herbicide laws vary state to state, and I can only recommend Virginia. Um, Typically, you're looking at using a three-way herbicide with dicamba, 2,4-D, and ideally triclopyr. And again, that might take repeated applications. I kind of gave up trying to use herbicide on my wild strawberries, which is why I ended up trying to hand pull them. And it's been a fight for a few years to try and get rid of it. This is not an easy plant to get rid of, but try 2,4-D, dicamba, and triclopyr. And if you need those spelled out, send us an email, and I'll send you that. And one of the reasons Don mentioned with the PMG, one of the reasons why they give you the chemical name instead of brand names is because some of the brands will switch their formulations seasonally. And so, for example, and I'm just going to use Weed Be Gone as an example. Weed Be Gone, one Weed Be Gone formula in the spring might have dicamba 2,4-D and triclopyr, and then maybe in the fall they switch over to 2,4-D dicamba and something like mecoprop. It's just a seasonal variation, and some companies do it, some don't. Some companies do it with only part of their brand. Some will do it with all of theirs. But that's why you want to look at the chemical and read the label. And one other thing about reading the label is the law. If you purchase an herbicide, you are legally responsible for applying it correctly, storing it correctly, and disposing of it correctly. So it's really important that you read the label to protect yourself and to use the chemical correctly so you don't hurt yourself and so you don't hurt the environment.
Okay, Thomas, we had a couple others and a couple questions in the chat box. I believe Terry has a question.
Yes, I have a question. I have a whole section of my yard that is so overgrown and the soil is very compacted and unhealthy. So I would like to just kill everything off and start over with seed. And I prefer not to use chemicals because I have small children and dogs. Is there a technique? Someone told me you can use solarization or lasagna planting. And I was just wondering what you recommend if I want to do a whole large section of my yard. And I'm in Northern Virginia.
Okay. So let's explain both of those things that you mentioned. So lasagna planting is basically where you put down cardboard and you put down layers of brown and green. You give it a season to smother whatever's underneath it and for those nutrients to break down, and then you plant into it. Solarization is basically where you hose down the area that you want. Well, first of all, you cut it as low as you can. Then you hose down the area to get it wet, and then you put thick, clear plastic on top of it, and you leave that for a season. So solarization works fairly well, but you need high heat. So that's one of those things that you're going to want to do in the spring to be ready to plant in the fall. The tricky part about that is that if you've got Bermuda grass may not be killed off by solarization. And if you've got really aggressive Bermuda grass, sometimes it can actually puncture the plastic. Lasagna, same situation, again, because you're in Northern Virginia, you're going to reseed with cool season grasses, I'm assuming. So you want to be able to seed in the fall. You do your lasagna prep in the spring. Actually, technically, you could do it this fall and just give it a whole year if you really wanted to. And actually, quite honestly, if it were me, actually, let me back up for a minute. Is this front yard? Or
I
another?
actually have a section in both the front yard and the backyard.
How crazy is your HOA?
Yeah, they're kind of a pain. That's
Okay.
why I'm worried.
Okay, so this is what you do for the backyard. For the backyard, what I would do is I would do it now, and for your last layer, put compost down and then seed Daikon radishes. Daikon radishes are the long, slender oriental radishes. They're great for busting up clay, because what will happen is they will go down, they will expand, and that will break up some of the clay. Over the winter, the freeze will kill them. Their top growth will drop down and give you a nice mat of weed protection. It's not perfect, but it'll help. And then over the winter also, that root will decay and microbes will process that into nutrients, and you'll have much looser soil. That's probably not going to fly in the front yard. In the front yard, what I would probably do is same thing, lasagna, especially if you can make it look like you're starting a flower bed. A lot of HOAs are okay with that, depending on how big it is and where it is in your yard. But I would either cover it with mulch as the top layer, or I would put in some kind of cover crop that you could mow with a weed whacker. And that could be something like cereal rye or winter wheat, oats, something like that. That would probably be your best bet, or just mulch and let it sit. You'll probably have to weed it in the spring and the summer because weed seeds will blow in. But once you get next fall, you should have really nice soil underneath that's fairly loose, and you should be able to plant into that.
Okay, and with the Daikon radishes, will they push through the cardboard?
Oh yeah, cardboard. Yeah, they probably will. I forgot about the cardboard. Actually, what I would do is I would put mulch on top of it, wait until spring, because by spring the cardboard will have decomposed enough, then plant with Daikon radishes. Daikons are just like any other radish, they're cool season. And so you plant them early in the spring. I've let them go all summer, and they can get, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches around if you give them enough time to grow. But you could plant those in early spring after the winter moisture and the microbes have loosened up that cardboard, and it will go right through the cardboard.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Nancy Hanrahan had her hand up.
Hey, Nancy.
Hey, Thomas, did you say that there is a control besides just pulling it for the Japanese stilt grass?
There is. So Japanese stilt grass, as Don mentioned, one of the characteristics of weed seeds is they put out a lot of seeds, and Japanese stilt grass puts out lots of seeds. So Japanese stilt grass is one of those that it's going to take years to fully control. And ideally, you're going to want to work with your neighbors who have it, because otherwise it'll spread back into your yard. So there's a twofold method here if we're talking chemical. One is you would apply a grass killer product, and let me back up for a minute and talk about grass killer products. Typically, our weed grass killers in whatever area you're in are safe for the turf that you have. There are exceptions, and this is the reason why you want to read the label. But I'm talking Northern Virginia, cool season grasses. Most of our weed killer grass formulations are fine for fescue, and basically they will kill warm season annuals, which siltgrass is one of them. However, you have all the seed that's in the soil that's going to germinate, and that seed lasts for a fairly long time. So the way that you deal with it is that once you kill it, you wait until next spring, and in early March, and again, I'm talking Northern Virginia, you're going to want to put down a crabgrass preventer. A crabgrass pre-emergent will work on stiltgrass. It won't be 100%, so you may have to pull things here and there, but it's going to be several years of using pre-emergent to kind of exhaust that seed bank to get rid of stilt grass. But again, you got to work with your neighbors, because stilt grass can spread from the next door. It can spread on animal fur. It can get washed into your yard from uphill. So it's not an easy one it is an easy one in a way, but it's one that's going to take a while to get rid of completely.
And I noticed it coming up and filling in the lawn late in the summer, like late August. Is that what it normally does?
It normally comes up earlier than that. Usually it will come up mid to late spring. Are you sure it's stilt grass? If it's coming up in August, that would be my question.
Yeah. Well, it came up after we got all that rain.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that
will the early crabgrass treatment address the late summer germination?
No, because most crabgrass preventer has persistence, a given persistence, and so you may have to reapply it later in the season. Depending on what product you use, depends on how long it will last in the environment, and also depending on how much rain you get. For example, 2 years ago when we had that rainy spring where it seemed to rain all spring, people put crabgrass preventer down repeatedly and it didn't do anything because it basically got diluted and washed away.
All right. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have a question. We bought mulch that was absolutely polluted with thistle. It migrated into the lawn. How do we get rid of that?
No. Buy a donkey. Donkeys like thistle. Short of that, I don't know what herbicide combination off the top of my head. I'd have to look that up. If you send me an email, I can look it up and get back to you. And it depends a little on what kind of thistle it is. And so if you could send pictures of that thistle, I can give you a more accurate answer. But it's going to take probably a 3 or 4 way broadleaf herbicide.
Okay, Jan and Linda have been answering a lot of the questions. Let's see, how do you avoid bringing new weeds to a site with the purchase of topsoil?
You don't. Topsoil and mulch can bring in weed seeds. Compost can too if it's not fully composted. Don mentioned the county facilities here in Prince William, and a lot of counties have compost outfits. And so typically in big, large-scale composting, they get it hot enough where it's going to kill weed seeds. With topsoil and with mulch, you're going to get weed seeds. It's just the nature of the beast, because there's going to be seeds in that soil. There's going to be seeds that blew into that mulch while it was sitting there. And it's just a matter of, you've got to be careful. Honestly, I wouldn't bring in topsoil to a lawn unless you need to level things out. And even then, I would mix it heavily with compost, because the compost is going to do more for your yard than the topsoil will. But yeah, it's something you can't avoid, and you've got to just be mindful that there are weed seeds there and be able to get on top of it.
There was a question about how many inches thick should a mulch dressing be around trees to avoid the re-emergence of weeds?
So mulching trees is a whole different issue. So when we're talking about mulching trees, we want a layer that's probably 2 to 3 inches thick. You want it back from the trunk, because you don't want that moisture being trapped up against the trunk, because that can cause some disease issues. But 2 to 3 inches. Now, the other thing to remember is you're not putting 2 to 3 inches on every year. Yes, mulch is going to break down over time, but if you keep stacking that mulch higher and higher, you're going to run into problems. The other thing is the higher you stack the mulch, the more likely it is to compact on itself. Outside our office, unfortunately, we don't control the landscaping, but we've got, I don't know, 8, 9 inches of mulch around the trees outside. And after a big heavy rain, even in the fall where the leaves are all gone, you can dig down only about a half an inch and you'll realize that no water penetrated into that mulch. So you don't want to go too heavy with that. It's a good idea every year to check your depth. If you don't need to add mulch, it's good to rake it up to keep it from compacting on itself. And when I say rake it up, I don't mean take it away. I mean just loosen it a little bit with a rake.
One other question is, preen a good product to use as a pre-emergent before applying hardwood mulch to beds? And do you apply it in the fall or the spring?
It depends. So preen is a pre-emergent product that has no fertilizer in it, and which is good for lawns. You definitely don't want to add pre-emergent with fertilizer in most cases in lawns because you end up over fertilizing. But preen is a fine pre-emergent. It depends on really on what you're trying to prevent. Preen works on grasses, so it's not going to do anything against sedges. It's not going to do anything against most broadleaf weeds. The other issue is spring or fall. It depends on what grasses you're trying to get rid of. Typically, the only winter weed grass we get is annual bluegrass, but usually you don't really see that until the spring. And so in that case, you would put preen down in late fall. But for, crabgrass, goose grass, those kinds of things, which most people worry about, I would apply that in the spring. Typically, if we take stilt grass out of the equation, because stilt grass you got to get early, but if you're looking to control crabgrass, goose grass, and foxtail, crabgrass is the earliest germinating. And so about the time that forsythia reaches full bloom until about half the petals of those flowers fall off, that's the time when you make your first application of pre-emergent. Again, talking Northern Virginia.
I believe that's all the questions. I think Linda and Jan answered the others. If we missed your question, could you please raise your hand? Or if there are any other questions?
If you think of questions, let me do that. If you think of questions, use this email, mastergardener@pwcgov.org. We're happy to answer questions about lawns, landscape, those kinds of things. Also, if you've got questions about things not in this, if you've got questions about wildlife, we can answer those questions as well. We do insect identification, we do disease identification, all those sorts of things. If you've got comments on this class, if you have suggestions for other class, please let us know. Our Wednesday class series will continue indefinitely, although as we get into winter, we're going to be less frequent because of the holidays. Our next class is on bluebirds, and that will be next Wednesday at 11. Thank you all for coming, and we appreciate you viewing. You will be sent an evaluation. We ask that you please fill that out and return it. Those evaluations are important for our stakeholders to show them what we're doing and how effective that we're being at what we are doing. So again, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.